"Hold it right there," roared Officer Miller, lunging at Mr. Elijah Vance as he stepped past the checkout at Greenwood Grocers in downtown Oak Haven. The scene was so jarring that shoppers dropped their baskets, their eyes wide with disbelief as two officers roughly shoved Mr. Vance against the display, a man who hadn't even raised his voice. Elijah, a serene expression on his face, offered little resistance. He'd only popped in for coffee and some medicine for his ailing mother. But none of that mattered when prejudice took hold. "Think we didn't see you stuffing things into your jacket? People like you only know how to steal," sneered Officer Davis, his finger jabbing accusingly, his disdain undisguised. Elijah tried to explain that his receipt was in his pocket, that he'd already paid, but his words were drowned out by the officers' furious shouts and the commotion they were creating. Onlookers began recording with their phones, some fueled by indignation, others by morbid curiosity. The tension hung thick in the air. Elijah pressed his lips together, remaining still. "Why not check the cameras before you humiliate me?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled. He didn't plead, didn't yell. He just wanted to be heard. But the officers seemed more intent on asserting their authority than on finding the truth. "No need for cameras when we already know what you are," scoffed Officer Davis. "You're a thief, and if you don't cooperate, this is going to get a lot worse." By now, Elijah had stopped thinking about himself. His thoughts turned to his mother, to his father who had died after being unjustly accused, and to how many times he had witnessed others endure the same ordeal. The shoving continued. One officer rummaged through his pockets while the other held him from behind. In the commotion, Elijah's coat fell open completely, and then silence descended. Inside his jacket hung a gleaming gold badge and a blue identification card. He was a federal investigator with over 25 years of service. The officer's demeanor shifted instantly, but they still couldn't bring themselves to admit their mistake. One step back, the other stammered, "Is that real? Why didn't you say anything?" Elijah looked him directly in the eye. "I didn't have to." The crowd, previously expectant, now erupted in murmurs. "I recorded everything." "This was abuse," a woman shouted. Another added, "This was pure discrimination." Yet, neither officer offered an apology. They exchanged glances, searching for an escape, as if Elijah's position of authority was their only concern. Not the harm, not the humiliation, just the fear of consequences. "Look, sir," one of the officers ventured, "you have to understand we were just doing our duty. There was a report." Elijah interrupted, his voice steady. "What report? Who reported? Or was it just the color of my skin that made you act this way?" The question hung in the air, an unfired bullet. No one answered, only the echo of his voice through the aisles filled with food and shame. The customers who had merely observed now approached Elijah, many offering words of support, others with glances heavy with guilt for not having intervened sooner. Elijah turned to them and said, "I didn't come here as an agent. I came as a citizen, as a son. And if this happened to me, what could happen to anyone else without a badge to protect them?" The officers, feeling the pressure, tried to calm the situation, urging him not to escalate it further. Elijah simply took a deep breath, his hands still in his jacket, and walked toward the exit without looking back. But just as he reached the supermarket doors, another patrol car screeched to a halt outside. A superior officer, his expression confused, stepped out. Apparently, the officers had called for backup to handle an aggressive suspect. Elijah stopped short, seeing the new officer who looked at him with surprise, then with a mix of respect and concern. "Elijah, what happened here?" the new chief asked. Elijah turned slowly, the crowd behind him. His answer was short but powerful. "Ask them." That's where it ended for now, because what followed wouldn't just be an apology. It would be a cascade of consequences that would bring those who believe themselves above the law to their knees. The superior officer pushed through the crowd, visibly uncomfortable with so many cameras recording. As he reached Elijah, he immediately sensed the tension. "What did you do?" he asked the two nervous officers, who avoided his gaze. Elijah said nothing, standing firm, his badge still visible, as the murmuring of the crowd swelled like a public trial. The chief tried to defuse the situation, but the damage was already done. "That man did nothing," an elderly woman shouted from the back. "They treated him like an animal." Far from calming down, the officers began to justify their actions. "We received an alert about suspicious behavior," one of them lied. But there was no registered alert, no actual report. It had all been an assumption born of prejudice and reinforced by the uniform. The chief, who had known Elijah for years, began to grasp the gravity of the problem. Still, he couldn't simply accept that two members of his team had acted so recklessly in front of witnesses, cameras, and a federal agent. Elijah, his voice tempered, approached the chief. "You know me. You know how many years I've given to this, and still, I have to walk around showing my badge, so I'm not treated like a criminal." The chief nodded in silence, feeling increasingly small in the face of the enormous error. One of the customers shouted that he had already uploaded the video to social media and that it was going viral. It was too late to hide what had happened. The entire country was about to see how authority could stumble due to its own bias. One of the officers, the most impulsive, raised his voice, attempting to regain ground. "It wasn't personal. We did what we thought was right. We also risk our lives every day." Elijah looked at him without blinking. "And you think that justifies humiliating an innocent person? Using your uniform as a shield for your prejudices? What you did isn't protecting, it's abusing. And that doesn't just affect me. It affects everyone who comes after those who don't have a badge to defend themselves." The tension reached its peak when an agent who had just arrived approached and whispered something in the chief's ear. The chief instantly paled. The video was already on national news. Central Command had called. They wanted explanations. And not only that, a civil rights commission was heading to the scene to collect testimonies. Greenwood Grocers decided to close its doors immediately, alarmed by the scale of the scandal. The officers were moved to a corner while Elijah was escorted, this time with respect, to a private room. Inside, the chief offered an official apology, but Elijah didn't accept it. "Empty apologies don't heal what happened. What I need is action, accountability, because if this happened to me, it could happen to someone else tomorrow. I want on record. I want in their files. I want them not to forget." The chief nodded and promised to initiate an internal investigation. But Elijah knew that the most powerful force wouldn't be what he said, but what the video was already telling the entire world. Days later, the story had exploded in the media. Elijah was invited to national programs, not as a victim, but as a voice of dignity. The images of the officers yelling, shoving him, and his calm response resonated with millions of people who saw themselves reflected in him. The Human Rights Commission issued a report recommending severe sanctions. The officers were suspended without pay, and a reform in public interaction protocols was announced, driven in part by media pressure. But the most important outcome wasn't the suspension. It was the change that began to stir in the minds of many. Elijah received hundreds of letters, especially from older adults who thanked him for his bravery, for not exploding in anger, for maintaining his integrity when everything pushed him to the contrary. In one email, a retired ex-officer wrote, "You did what many of us wanted to do, but didn't have the courage." Elijah, without seeking it, had become a symbol of something far greater than himself. Now, when he walked down the street, people greeted him with respect. Not for the badge, not for the uniform, but for what he had demonstrated. That true authority isn't imposed, it's earned with dignity. And although he never sought fame, he understood that sometimes for the world to awaken, someone has to endure humiliation and respond with truth, because as he himself said in an interview, you never know who is behind the mask. Appearances can be deceiving, but respect and dignity must always be non-negotiable.